1. The unexpected encounter. The world, for David Chen, the self-made millionaire, came to an abrupt, jarring halt. His pristine Mercedes, a silent testament to his hard-won success, idled precisely, yet his mind was miles away, across the bustling city street. There, at a worn bus stop, sat Kesha. It wasn't merely her presence that had seized him, though 5 years had passed since she'd vanished from his life without a whisper, blocking his number, erasing her tracks. No, what truly shocked him, what made the very air seem to thin and crackle around him, were the 3 boys playing around her. All of them, unmistakably, possessed his vivid green eyes, the same piercing gaze he saw reflected in the mirror every morning. Their faces were miniature blueprints of his own. 5 years. 5 years since Kesha, the vibrant, ambitious woman who had shared his ramen and dreams existence, had simply ceased to be. Back then, he was just David, the struggling founder of a tech startup, toiling 16 hours a day in a cramped apartment, fueled by cheap coffee and an unyielding vision. Now, at 32, he was the CEO of a $200 million company, with offices spanning 3 continents. He had conquered the cutthroat world of venture capital, outmaneuvered rivals, and built an empire from nothing. But in this singular, blinding moment, none of that mattered. All his achievements, all his wealth, felt like dust in the face of the impossible reality unfolding before him. There, playing at the most worn bus stop in the city, were 3 miniature versions of himself. Impossible, he muttered, the word a choked gasp. Without a second thought, he abruptly parked his gleaming Mercedes in the middle of the busy street. Horns blared behind him, a cacophony of angry frustration, but David didn't even register them. His eyes were glued, transfixed, on the 3 boys. All of them, clearly, were around 5 years old. All, undeniably, his children. The light brown hair that caught the afternoon sun, the way they tilted their heads in unison when curiosity struck, even the animated gestures they used when talking to each other, everything was a perfect, uncanny copy of him. Kesha, however, looked thinner, etched with a weariness that hadn't been there before. Her simple clothes and the cracked screen of her cell phone stood in stark, heartbreaking contrast to the last time he'd seen her, when she still wore the expensive dresses he had insisted on buying for her. Now, she was counting coins in the palm of her hand with one of the boys, their small heads bent in a shared, desperate calculation. Did they have enough money for the bus fare? A wrenching pain, sharp and visceral, ripped through David's chest. It felt as if someone had reached inside, torn out his heart, and trampled on it. While he collected luxury cars, while he dined at 5-star restaurants where a single meal cost more than a family's weekly groceries, his children, his own children, were counting pennies for public transportation. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a wave of sickening guilt. He crossed the street as if in a trance, barely registering the blaring horn of a taxi that narrowly missed him. Kesha looked up from her phone, her eyes widening, and paled dramatically when she saw him approaching. Automatically, instinctively, she pulled the children closer, a lioness protecting her cubs from an unforeseen threat. Kesha, his voice emerged hoarse, a raw rasp laden with 5 years of unanswered questions, of silent torment. David. She stammered, clearly unprepared for this impossible encounter. Her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled her cracked cell phone into her worn purse. These are my children, he stated, not as a question, but as an undeniable, gut-wrenching truth. The resemblance was simply too striking to deny. One of the boys even had the small, distinctive scar on his chin, precisely where David had gotten his own from a childhood bike fall at age 6. One of the boys, more curious than his brothers, took a tentative step forward. "Mommy, who's that man?" His voice was soft, polite, yet carried a surprising maturity that shouldn't exist in a 5-year-old. David felt as if someone had ripped the very air from his lungs. The boy's voice, even the way he tilted his head when he asked questions, everything was a miniature echo of himself. How had he missed this? How had he missed 5 years of watching these boys grow up, of hearing their first words, of witnessing their every tiny milestone? "They're 5, aren't they?" David insisted, his mind frantically calculating the dates. "You were pregnant when you disappeared. When you cut me off without an explanation." Kesha closed her eyes for a moment, her face a canvas of internal struggle, clearly torn between revealing the truth or concocting another desperate lie. When she opened them again, there was a mixture of pain and guilt in their depths that he had never seen before. "David, this is not the time or place for this conversation," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. 5 years, Kesha." His voice rose higher than he intended, causing a few passers-by to look curiously, their conversations momentarily hushed. 5 years of my children you hid from me. 5 years I'll never get back." One of the boys, clearly frightened by the raised voices, instinctively hid behind his mother's legs. David forced himself to lower his voice, but the raw anger still burned in his throat. "Why? Why did you do this to me?" She stood up quickly, holding the 3 boys' hands tightly. "You don't understand the situation. I tried to tell you. I tried to talk to you, but..." "But what?" David cut her off, his voice laced with bitter accusation. "You ran away like a coward. You blocked me from everything and pretended we never existed." The bus was approaching in the distance, a massive, rumbling yellow behemoth. Kesha began to gently push the children toward the sidewalk, a desperate urgency in her movements. "Mom, do we have enough money for all 3 of us?" asked one of the boys, showing a few crumpled coins in his small, outstretched palm. The words hit David like a punch in the stomach. His children. His own children were worried about $2 for the bus, while he had unlimited credit cards, a wallet stuffed with hundreds, in his pocket. "Kesha, wait." He tried to grab her arm, but she quickly pulled away, her movements sharp, almost frantic. "I couldn't raise 3 kids on my own and work and give you the attention you always demanded," she whispered quickly, looking around nervously as if she expected someone to appear, some unseen threat lurking in the urban landscape. "Some people didn't want you to know. People who had a lot to lose if you found out." "What people? What are you talking about?" But the bus had already stopped, its pneumatic doors hissing open. Kesha was pushing the children inside with an urgency that seemed to go beyond simply catching transportation. "I can't talk about it here. It's not safe." The bus door closed with a final, definitive sigh before David could fully process what she had said. Some people didn't want him to know. People who had a lot to lose. What the hell did that mean? And why did she seem more afraid of someone else than of him? He stood on the sidewalk, watching the bus drive away, carrying his 3 unknown children further and further into a past he had been denied. For the first time in years, David Chen, the man who had built a tech empire from scratch, who had faced down racist investors and hostile boards, felt utterly, completely lost. But one thing he knew for sure: someone had deliberately kept his children away from him. Someone with enough power to make Kesha disappear and remain hidden for 5 long years. And when David found out who had dared to mess with his life like this, that person would pay dearly for stealing 5 years of his life as a father. As he walked back to his car, a cold, unyielding determination took hold of him. He had survived bankruptcy, overcome racial discrimination disguised as a lack of experience, and built an empire against all odds. Finding out the truth about his children would be a piece of cake compared to what he had already faced. But standing there, next to the Mercedes that cost more than many people earn in 2 years, David Chen realized something that disturbed him even more. Kesha hadn't just hidden his children. She was protecting them from someone. And that person was still a threat. The bus, a lumbering yellow beast, pulled away from the curb, leaving David stranded on the sidewalk, the acrid smell of its diesel fumes stinging his nostrils. He watched, transfixed, as his 3 unknown children, miniature versions of himself, disappeared from view. A cold, hollow ache settled in his chest, deeper than any business failure or personal slight. Some people didn't want him to know. People who had a lot to lose. The words echoed in his mind, a cryptic, terrifying riddle. Who? And why did Kesha, the strong, independent woman he remembered, seem so utterly terrified? The next 72 hours were a blur of obsessive, frantic research for David. He cancelled all meetings, ignored his buzzing phone, and immersed himself completely in the digital ghost hunt. What he found only deepened the knot of dread in his stomach. Kesha worked as an administrative assistant at a small accounting firm, earning barely enough to support 1 child, let alone 3. She lived in a modest apartment in the suburbs, a world away from the upscale neighborhoods they used to frequent together. But what truly caught his attention, what sent a shiver of unease down his spine, were her social media photos. In every single one, Kesha deliberately avoided showing the children's faces fully, always in profile or partially obscured, as if she were desperately hiding them from someone who might recognize them. Then came the discovery that made his blood boil. Kesha was married. Her husband was Brandon Mitchell, a corporate lawyer at his family's prestigious firm, Mitchell & Associates. Brandon's Instagram was a carefully curated facade of domestic bliss. Photos of him, Kesha, and the 3 boys on expensive vacations, at fancy restaurants, at exclusive social events. Brandon presented himself as the boys' proud father, basking in comments praising him as an exemplary family man. A rage, cold and absolute, unlike anything David had felt in years, surged through him. Not only had his children been hidden from him, but another man was reaping the emotional and social rewards of fatherhood, leveraging his sons to build a public image. David decided to investigate further. Using his extensive contacts in the business world, he quickly uncovered that the Mitchell family wielded significant power in the local legal scene. Brandon's father, Robert Mitchell Sr., was an influential lawyer with political connections extending to the state government. By Wednesday night, David had hired a private investigator, a ghost in the shadows. By Friday, a detailed report landed in his hands, making his stomach churn with disgust. The report painted a chilling picture. Brandon had met Kesha when she was 5 months pregnant. According to witnesses, he had convinced her that David, with his unstable past, referring to David's impoverished upbringing and struggles to build his company, would never be a good father. Even more disturbing, Brandon had offered Kesha financial stability in exchange for her never revealing the identity of the children's biological father. The investigator had even gained access to old messages between Kesha and her sister, where Kesha confessed to being terrified that David would show up and try to take the kids away, and how Brandon had assured her that would never happen if she kept it a secret. But the worst was yet to come. David discovered that Brandon had known his identity from the beginning. He had done his own research on David when he started dating Kesha, knowing exactly who the boy's biological father was. He had deliberately kept that information secret, manipulating Kesha and leveraging the situation to build his own heroic narrative. The messages the investigator obtained showed Brandon brazenly bragging to his friends about how he had rescued Kesha from an arrogant businessman who had abandoned her when she was pregnant. He had created a whole, elaborate narrative where David was the irresponsible villain, and he, Brandon, was the selfless hero who had saved a struggling single mother. David realized that during all those years, while he was painstakingly building his business empire, Brandon was constructing another kind of empire. One built on lies, manipulation, and the blatant theft of another man's fatherhood. The breaking point came when David discovered that Brandon had even used the adopted children's story to secure a promotion at his father's firm. In newspaper articles and interviews about corporate social responsibility, Brandon was presented as an exemplar of a young lawyer committed to family causes, who had generously adopted 3 children from his wife's previous relationship. The hypocrisy was sickening. Brandon profited financially and socially from the fatherhood he had stolen from David, while Kesha lived modestly, clearly dependent on his generosity to support children who were not even legally recognized as David's. What disturbed David most was a final, chilling discovery. Brandon had meticulously documented all of his manipulation. The investigator found emails where Brandon discussed with a colleague how keeping the biological father away was essential to maintaining the narrative. There was even a detailed plan for what to do if the real father ever showed up. Brandon not only knew about David, he had actively prepared to prevent any attempt at reconciliation. He had instructed Kesha on how to disappear if necessary, promised legal support if David tried to cause trouble, and even prepared an alternative narrative in which David would be portrayed as an unstable man trying to kidnap children who did not legally belong to him. Sitting in his penthouse office, with all these damning documents spread out on his desk, David Chen felt something he hadn't felt since the hardest, most desperate days of building his company. A cold, calculating rage. Brandon Mitchell had completely underestimated who he was dealing with. Because while Brandon played manipulative lawyer games, David had learned a valuable lesson building his empire from scratch. The difference between truly powerful people and people who just play at power is that the truly powerful know how to wait for the right moment to strike. And David Chen had spent the last 5 years becoming very, very powerful. What Brandon didn't know was that every arrogant email, every documented manipulation, every carefully constructed lie, was about to become the precise tool of his own destruction. When you steal 5 years of a father's life and then meticulously document the betrayal as if it were a personal achievement, you're signing your own death warrant. David spent the next week immersed in a meticulous investigation that would make any professional detective envious. But this time, he wasn't just gathering information. He was building a case that would destroy Brandon Mitchell so completely, he would never recover. The first step was to enlist Rebecca Santos, a family law attorney who had gained national fame for her relentless pursuit of men who used power and money to control women and children, especially in cases involving denied paternity and family manipulation. "This case is even worse than I thought," Rebecca said, her voice tight with professional outrage, after reviewing all the documents David had collected. "Brandon didn't just hide your children from you. He created an elaborate scheme of psychological coercion and financial dependence to keep Kesha under his control." She showed David evidence he hadn't even considered. Bank records indicating that Brandon completely controlled Kesha's finances. She had no account of her own, no credit cards in her name, not even direct access to the money that was supposedly for the kids. Everything went through him. "Look at this," Rebecca pointed to a series of emails she had obtained through legal contacts. Brandon meticulously documented how to keep Kesha dependent. There are messages where he discusses with colleagues how a woman with 3 kids could never support herself, and how this ensured she would never cause any trouble. David felt his anger grow exponentially. It wasn't just about his children anymore. Brandon had turned Kesha into a golden prisoner, using the boys as leverage to control every aspect of her life. But what truly made David's blood boil was discovering that Brandon had used his children to gain even greater professional advantages than David had imagined. The lawyer had applied for a coveted position on the board of directors of a major foundation that helped disadvantaged families, using the inspiring story of having adopted 3 abandoned children as his main qualification. In public interviews available online, Brandon spoke with feigned tears in his eyes about how he had found a desperate young mother abandoned by the children's father, and how he had decided to give this family destroyed by male irresponsibility a chance. The audience always gave him a standing ovation when he described how the boys called him Dad, and how he was proud to be the only father they ever knew. David discovered that this fabricated narrative had earned Brandon not only his prestigious position at the foundation, but also a significant raise at his law firm and even a Young Professional of the Year award from the local bar association. The hypocrisy was sickening. Brandon was profiting financially, socially, and professionally from a lie he had orchestrated, while the children's real father was being portrayed as an irresponsible man who had abandoned his family. That's when David discovered something that completely changed his strategy for revenge. Among the documents Rebecca had obtained was a life insurance policy Brandon had taken out on the 3 boys, naming himself as the sole beneficiary. The amount was absurdly high, $500,000 per child, for perfectly healthy 5-year-olds. It was an investment that only made sense if Brandon expected something to happen to them. "This is disturbing on so many levels," Rebecca commented, her voice grim, analyzing the document. "Legally, he has no right to take out insurance on children who are not legally his. And the amount suggests that he was planning something," David finished, feeling a chilling premonition. Further investigation revealed that Brandon had consulted lawyers about adoption procedures in cases where the biological father is deemed unfit. There was also research in his history on how to prove emotional instability and document erratic behavior of former partners. David realized with horror that Brandon wasn't just hiding his children. He was preparing a case to remove them permanently from any possibility of contact with their biological father. And the insurance policies suggested that Brandon's plans for the children were even more sinister. "We need to act fast," Rebecca said, her tone urgent. "But we also need to be smart. If Brandon realizes we've uncovered his plans, he may rush whatever he's been plotting." That's when David made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting Brandon directly or immediately exposing his findings, he would start playing Brandon's game, but with completely different rules. David used his contacts in the business world to discreetly approach the foundation where Brandon had secured his board position. Without revealing his personal connection to the case, he offered a substantial donation to support the excellent work they were doing with underprivileged families. The $100,000 donation secured David not only privileged access to the foundation's events but also the opportunity to observe Brandon closely, learn his habits, his weaknesses, and most importantly, document every lie he told publicly about his adoptive family. What Brandon didn't know was that every event, every speech, every interview where he repeated his fabricated story was being carefully recorded and documented. David was building a complete file of evidence that would prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that Brandon's entire heroic narrative was a calculated hoax. But David had an even more elaborate plan. Using his vast technological resources, he had created a complete digital dossier on Brandon's manipulations, including recordings, financial records, emails, and even the chilling evidence of his suspicious research into life insurance for children. The dossier would be sent simultaneously to 3 devastating destinations: the Lawyers Association that had honored Brandon, the foundation where he served on the board, and most importantly, an investigative journalist specializing in family corruption whom David had met through professional contacts. Sitting in his office in the early hours of Friday morning, with all the documents organized and the plan finalized, David Chen smiled for the first time in weeks. Brandon Mitchell had spent years building a reputation based on lies and manipulation. In 72 hours, all of that would come crashing down so spectacularly that he would never be able to recover. What Brandon didn't realize was that every lie he had told, every manipulation he had documented, every exploitation of the situation, was about to become the precise tool of his own total destruction. When you build an empire based on falsehoods, it only takes one well-placed truth to make it all come crashing down like a house of cards. David had learned a valuable lesson building his company. Strategic patience always beats impulsive arrogance. And Brandon Mitchell was about to discover the agonizing price of underestimating a man who had much more to lose and much more power to fight back than he could ever imagine. The annual event for the Foundation for Needy Families was packed, a glittering assembly of the city's legal elite, influential politicians, and wealthy philanthropists. Brandon Mitchell, impeccable in his tuxedo, exuded an air of confident success as he prepared for his speech as a newly appointed board member. He was basking in the glow of his fabricated reputation, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond the stage. Then, his phone began to vibrate incessantly in his pocket. The first call was from his father, his voice strained with a barely contained panic. "Brandon, what the hell have you done? I'm getting calls from journalists asking about document forgery." Before Brandon could even stammer a response, a second call came in from his senior partner at Mitchell & Associates. "Mitchell, you need to come in here now. Documents have arrived proving that you lied about everything." Brandon felt the blood drain from his face, his confident facade cracking. He barely registered the third notification, an email that had just arrived. The sender was unknown, but the subject line was a hammer blow: 5 years of lies, complete evidence. With trembling hands, he clicked. The attachment contained everything: every arrogant email he had sent discussing his manipulations, every document where he had meticulously planned to keep David away, every conversation where he had boasted about stealing a family. Even the chillingly suspicious insurance contracts for the children. On the second page, a DNA analysis confirming that David Chen was the biological father of the 3 boys, accompanied by a legal report detailing how Brandon had used psychological coercion to control Kesha. The sheer, meticulous detail of the evidence was horrifying. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the presenter, her voice booming through the ballroom, "our next speaker is Brandon Mitchell, known for his dedication to families in need." Brandon, his legs suddenly feeling like lead, stumbled onto the stage. He was oblivious to the quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the room, unaware that David Chen was sitting discreetly in the 3rd row, watching in real time as the reputation he had spent years building was about to be utterly annihilated. "I would like to talk about honesty," Brandon began, his voice faltering as he saw several people in the audience simultaneously checking their phones, their faces morphing from polite attentiveness to shocked disbelief. That's when investigative journalist Marcus Reed, a formidable figure known for his incisive reporting, stood up from the crowd. "Mr. Mitchell," Reed's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. "Is it true that you impersonated the father of 3 children whose biological father was deliberately kept away through manipulation?" The silence was deafening, suffocating. Brandon tried to speak, his mouth dry, but the words wouldn't come out. In the audience, cell phones lit up like a constellation as people received the dossier David had sent simultaneously to journalists, foundation members, and Brandon's own colleagues at the firm. "According to documents we have just received," Reed continued, his voice gaining momentum, "you have profited financially and professionally from a false narrative about rescuing an abandoned family." David watched Brandon crumble publicly, his polished composure dissolving into a visible agony. Yet, he felt no pleasure in the man's humiliation, only the cold, stark satisfaction of seeing justice finally, undeniably done. He stood up quietly and left the ballroom before anyone could connect him to the devastating expose. 2 hours later, he was at Kesha's apartment door. She opened it, her eyes red-rimmed, already knowing the truth had been revealed. "Brandon called, screaming," she whispered, her voice fragile. "He lost his job. His family disowned him. He could be sued for fraud." "How do you feel?" David asked. Genuinely. A shy, relieved smile appeared on her face, a fragile blossom in the aftermath of years of fear. "I feel free." Just then, the 3 boys appeared at the door, looking at David not as a stranger, but with the natural curiosity of children who were finally beginning to understand they had a father. "Mom said you're our real dad," one of them stated directly, his small voice clear. "Yes, I am," David replied, kneeling down to their level, his voice thick with emotion. "And if you want, I would very much like to be a part of your lives." The next day, newspapers screamed the headlines. "Renowned lawyer loses everything after family manipulation scandal." The Bar Association opened an immediate ethics investigation. The foundation removed him from the board. His firm announced that it was re-evaluating his membership, a polite euphemism for expulsion. David received a call from Rebecca Santos. "The paperwork is ready, David. Kesha has voluntarily transferred joint custody rights. Legally, you are now recognized as the father." Meanwhile, Brandon, who a week earlier had been considered one of the most promising young lawyers in the city, found himself alone, surrounded by moving boxes, his carefully constructed life in ruins. His wife had already filed for divorce, colleagues avoided him, and even his parents publicly stated they were ashamed of his actions. David spent the weekend at the zoo with his 3 children, watching them discover the animals with unbridled joy, while Kesha walked beside them, visibly relaxed for the first time in years after being freed from Brandon's insidious control. "Daddy," the youngest asked, his voice innocent, "what happened to Brandon?" David paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. "He found out that when you build your life on lies, one day the truth comes out and knocks everything down." He looked at Kesha, then back at his sons. "The best revenge isn't becoming the monster who hurt you," he told Kesha quietly. "It's building something so good that the lies of others become irrelevant." Brandon had tried to use 3 innocent children as tools to build a false reputation. Now, those same children were living proof that the truth always finds a way to prevail. But as David watched his children discover the world around them, one question remained. Could a family torn apart by 5 years of lies truly reconnect and build something genuine on the rubble of so much manipulation and pain? 5. Justice served and new beginnings. 6 months after Brandon Mitchell's spectacular fall, David Chen watched his 3 children playing in the sun-dappled garden of the new house. It wasn't the cold, sterile luxury of his penthouse, but a warm, inviting home in a family-friendly neighborhood that he, Kesha, and the boys had bought together. "Dad, I did it," shouted the youngest of the 3, a triumphant cry echoing through the air as he finally mastered his training bike, pedaling unsteadily but independently across the grass. David felt a surge of pure, unadulterated pride, a joy that no business achievement, no multimillion-dollar deal had ever given him. Kesha approached, carrying a tray with homemade lemonade, her face radiating a newfound peace. "Brandon finally signed the permanent parental relinquishment papers," she said, her voice soft with relief. "It's official. You're their only father, legally." David nodded, but his gaze was fixed on the boys, a silent testament to the past few months. He had completely reorganized his life, working from home, attending school presentations, patiently teaching them to ride bikes, read stories, and navigate the small complexities of childhood. He had discovered that being a present, active father was infinitely more rewarding than any professional success. "And Brandon?" he asked, more out of curiosity than concern. "He's working as a paralegal at a small firm in the country," Kesha replied, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her voice. "The pay is a tenth of what he was making. His ex-wife remarried and moved out of state." David felt no pleasure in Brandon's misfortune, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served, that the scales had finally, irrevocably tipped. That night, during dinner, his middle son looked up at him, a thoughtful frown on his small face. "Dad, why did Brandon lie about being our father?" David thought for a moment before answering. Sometimes, people make bad choices when they want something that doesn't belong to them. But the truth always finds a way to come out, no matter how hard they try to bury it. Ironically, David's business was thriving more than ever. Brandon's exposure had inadvertently highlighted David's own compelling story, generating overwhelmingly positive media coverage. Business magazines interviewed him about balancing his staggering professional success with his newfound family responsibilities. His story had inspired other fathers in similar, painful situations. David received dozens of messages from men who had discovered hidden children or were struggling with complex family manipulations. Rebecca Santos, his lawyer, had become one of the most sought-after attorneys in town. "Your case changed the public perception of parental manipulation," she told him. "Judges now take these situations much more seriously." A special report revealed that Brandon had, in fact, manipulated at least 3 different families over the years, always using the same insidious strategy. Other victims began to come forward, encouraged by David's bravery. He realized that his personal revenge had evolved into something much bigger, a movement to raise awareness about family manipulation and parental rights. On the first anniversary of being reunited with his children, David organized a celebratory party at the same park where he had first seen Kesha. Rebecca raised a toast, her voice clear and strong, to David, who proved that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemy, but building something so beautiful that their lies become irrelevant. As he watched his children laugh and play with the cousins they had finally met, David reflected on the tumultuous journey. Brandon had tried to steal 5 years of his fatherhood, but without knowing it, he had given David a profound gift: the opportunity to be the kind of father he might never have been if he hadn't gone through that agonizing loss. The real victory wasn't in Brandon's downfall, but in the vibrant, loving family they had built on the rubble of his lies. David had learned that true success wasn't measured in dollars or professional recognition, but in small, precious moments like teaching a child to ride a bike or a shared laugh over a scraped knee. 6 months later, David learned that Brandon had tried to run for a minor public office, using a manufactured narrative of personal redemption. The candidacy lasted only a week, quickly dissolving when someone shared the old news stories about his manipulative patterns on social media. Some people, David mused, never learn that the truth has a long memory and infinite patience. Brandon had tried to use 3 innocent children as tools to build a false reputation. Now, those same children were living proof that the truth always finds a way to prevail. David had discovered that the best revenge is not to become the monster who hurt you, but to build something so extraordinary that your enemies become irrelevant in the face of your happiness. Deep research. Canvas.